Thank you, Michael, and thank you to the Institute for Radical Imagination for inviting me. I'm happy to do that, and I hope that the Weber I'm going to present here is not a Weber that is normally heard of. In reality, I think it has never been heard of, and you will have to judge if you know Weber enough as to the validity of this Weber that I'm going to present today, the subversive Weber. We could perhaps suspect that there is a subversive Weber by reading some of the Marxist scholars who have been interested, even if critical, in Weber's thought. But this is only a suspicion, and to my understanding, no Weber scholar has ever provided a focused analysis on Weber such that there is something truly subversive about it. There is something very interesting for Marxist thinkers regarding, for example, Weber's analysis of capitalism, but this is, and sometimes his understanding of politics, but this is it basically. Now, regarding mainstream Weber scholarship, there is no question that they have never provided any hint at all whatsoever regarding the existence of a subversive Weber. And this is not because they want to, let's say, to hide or, yes, I mean, they do not try to conceal that a subversive Weber exists, but rather because they entertain no desire whatsoever to see it. So mainstream Weber scholars have a fundamental lack of desire to see any subversive aspect in Weber's thought. That and this lack of desire is what defines the Weberology, to call it like that, they practice, or the Weberian scholarship that they practice. Now, we have to be clear that this claim that there is a subversive Weber is obviously done on the basis of the fact that Weber is certainly a conservative bourgeois thinker, a proud bourgeois thinker, I must add, who thought that rule domination was necessary in human life and that tried to buttress the rule domination of the German bourgeoisie. We will address this conservative Weber in the second seminar that I'm seeking to do here in the Institute of Radical Imagination. But today we will focus on the subversive Weber, a Weber to be found in his figure of subjectivation or stance, a stance of world confrontation, to give it a very provisional name. This may seem a particularly surprising claim to make. After all, nobody, as far as I know, has made it before. Yet it is precisely this claim that we will seek to prove today. Let me outline the issues I like to address in order to demonstrate this thesis. Now, I'm gonna put in the chat the main points that I'm going to address here. So I'm gonna just for you to see. So first of all, I will address the method, the approach method that I will follow to demonstrate in this thesis. Secondly, I will try to characterize in some detail Weber's figure of subjectivation or stance. Thirdly, I will explain the ontological foundations and the existential deployment of Weber's stance. So in that sense, the point here will be to show that Weber's figure of subjectivation, Weber's stance, is something alive. So I would like to show it to you, let's say, at work, how it functions in actual life. The fourth point I would like to address is about the play of tensions, and tension is a very fundamental, I was going to say almost passion, but it's a fundamental aspect in Weber's thought. So the play of tensions in the mode of distance, and here there are two fundamental concepts that I will address: responsibility and value freedom. Two fundamental concepts and very, very problematic in Weber's thought. And the last aspect I would like to address is about the priority of subjectivation over rationalization. So as I was saying, the point here is to bring out Weber's stance and see it at work as a living figure. So let us start with the first point, the method approach. So the method that I am to follow, method understood here in the broad sense of approach, is meant to be consistent with the subjective disposition that Weber demands from himself and his addressees. A subjective disposition embodied in and defined by Weber's stance. This means that the method is entirely immanent and therefore focused on the internal relations of Weber's thought. It is an immanent reading of Weber's work. Indeed, such reading, based on the internal relations of a thinker's thought and on what the thinker means, is, in my view, the very first reading to be done of any thinker. This method has thus two major traits. It is immanent and it prioritizes the subjective determinations of a thinker's thought. A method, let me add, that is particularly appropriate in the case of Weber, who made very clear subjective demands on himself and those he addressed. It is important to add in this connection that the theoretical language I would resort to seeks to combine Weber's own language with contemporary theory, above all in what concerns the terms subjectivation and subject, which Weber did not use but are central in my approach and are understood in line with the way in which they had been theorized in contemporary philosophy, for example, in Badiou and in Zizek, different as they might be. This way of proceeding, combining what I will call Weber's bourgeois terminology, vocation or calling, personality, dedication, conduct of life, with contemporary theory, can help us make manifest the untimely timeliness of Weber's thought. Now, as just said, Weber made very clear and distinct demands on himself and his addressees, demands which are authentic subjective prescriptions. Two of these prescriptions stand out and are well known, for Weber made them at crucial moments in some of his most renowned interventions, particularly in the two vocational lectures, Science as a Vocation and Politics as a Vocation. However, he never put these two prescriptions together in a consistent figure, nor did he explain how they are related to one another. That's precisely our task here. The first prescription enjoins us to look the fate of the age in its stern face, or, as he also says it, to ruthlessly scrutinize the realities of life. Let us call this the confrontation prescription. It is an injunction to confront the world without narcotics of any kind, whether religious or social conventional ones, or indeed political ones. Actually, I'm not going to talk here about this today, but Weber himself sometimes confronted reality with some narcotics, for example, nationalism. But in principle, the idea is to confront reality without narcotics, without mediations of any kind. The second prescription is the famous one involving the demon. It enjoins us to, quote, find and obey the demon who holds the threads of our lives. This prescription concerns both the idea of the calling or vocation and the question of personality, which for Weber is nothing but the permanence in the calling. So faithfulness to the demon. It seems that fitting to name it the subjectivation prescription. We thus have the two fundamental Weberian prescriptions, the subjectivation prescription and the confrontation prescription. The former is an injunction to become the faithful carriers of an inner conviction, or in contemporary theory parlance, to become subjects. The latter is an injunction to confront the world as the world is, not as we would like it to be. Both inseparably constitute the Weberian figure of subjectivation or stance, whose full shape we can already glimpse. Although they are two balls apart, in truth so heterogeneous that they form a disjunctive couple, yet the disjunction is not total, but joined together at the level of pure subjectivity. Its absolute singularity lies precisely in that the relationship between both components is not conceptual, nor based on any definite knowledge, theory of science, but constitutes a figure of antagonism held together only subjectively in the mode of tension. Weber's teaching summons us to confront the world and do so from the strength of our own stance. It also summons a science at the service of that endeavor, a science which consists of two major strands. One devoted to attest to the presence, consistency, and strength of the demon, or more generally, of what people ultimately want, and the other to the ruthless scrutiny of the world. This also means that following Weber's prescriptions is imperative to understand his thought. For such prescriptions stem not from some extrinsic necessity, but from the very foundations of his thought. Yet, not only is the central constitutive import of Weber's subjective determinations neglected in Weber scholarship, the main problem is that there is a scholastic canon which flattens those subjective determinations and appeases desire. And desire is very important in Weber. Such canonical structures are prominent and well entrenched in mainstream Weber scholarship. As other forms of canonization, that of Weber has one fundamental effect, one fundamental consequence, to wit, taming his thought. Another influential and in truth complementary canon is that stemming from vulgar Marxism and its treatment of Weber as a bourgeois thinker, with the emphasis on bourgeois, as if this determination exhausted the scope and autonomy of thought, which is thus denied, or it is the same, reduced to a technical endeavor at the service of bourgeois society. We thus take Weber's stance with the utmost theoretical and practical seriousness. Yet, social scientists, and particularly sociologists, have consistently neglected it. Why is this so? Well, Weber's science, the branch on the demon, is definitely of help to answer this question, for it confronts us with the deep and decisive question of "Que vuoi?" What do you really want? And can thereby reveal whether that refusal does not simply signal our aversion to reflect on our own stance and the gods we served. Now let's go to the second point. Let's try to characterize in some detail the Weberian figure of subjectivation or stance. The method I have set out to follow requires that we now characterize more precisely the subjective figure that drives Weber's thought, starting from the attempt to lay bare its very frame or its ultimate axioms, to use a key word from the beginning of the famous article on objectivity, entitled Objectivity, precisely. In reality, such a method is outlined in this essay, Objectivity, for it belongs to the branch of the Weberian science concerned with the demon, or, as Weber says here, with the desiring human being, and is devoted to undertaking, quote, a thoughtful reflection on the ultimate elements of meaningful human action, end quote. This thoughtful reflection may be called analytics of subjectivation, thus avoiding the flattening operation often referred to in the literature as value analysis, while taking full account of the fact that it is a mode of analysis concerned with praxis, not only with values. The analytics I want to apply here is concerned with the pure form of Weber's stance and has two moments. The first is aimed at grasping the conceptual articulation of the two prescriptions of Weber's stance, and the second at the existential orientation of the stance itself. Now, regarding the first moment, we already know the two prescriptions, authentic ultimate axioms that constitute the Weberian stance, the subjectivation prescription and the confrontation prescription. Although they form a disjunctive couple, yet they are subjectively, in the subjective figure they constitute, orientated to one another in an intrinsic manner, and only together do they acquire their full force. On the one hand, the prescription to confront the world makes the subjectivation prescription, obey the demon, immediately worldly, no transcendence then, but also no evasion. On the other hand, that prescription to confront the world acquires meaning, purpose, and the very energy it needs only to the extent that there is a demon, that is, an inner disposition orientated to project itself in the world and transform it accordingly. Now, it is evident that a conformist attitude requires not ruthless scrutiny of the world at all. Indeed, conformism, in Weber's definition, the simple, dull acceptance of the world and the profession, end quote, is as entirely adopted with Weber's stance as is evasion and, of course, mere or expedient adaptation to the world. The relationship between the two prescriptions is therefore not one of total or pure disjunction. What is at stake is an oppositional relation, but we need to determine its precise type or nature. Is this relation an antinomy? That is to say, are the two prescriptions incompatible? Many authors have considered different aspects of Weber's thought as antinomies, but it is Wolfgang Mommsen who has provided a more systematic analysis of what he calls the antinomian structure of Weber's thought. The interest of Mommsen's analysis lies, at least in part, in his very hesitations, which show, first, that the antinomian structure is not pure, for there are complementary elements, he says, or moments. So there are compatible elements. And second, that it contains aspects of contradiction, the famous dialectical contradiction, the opposition between two elements which nevertheless are interdependent. So there are aspects of contradiction as well. But Mommsen does not consider another form, which is actually the one that seems closest, even if it also fails to do full justice to the kind of relation involved in Weber's stance, namely the Deleuzian disjunctive synthesis, that is, a connection between two irreducibly different elements or series or processes such that something new is produced. Here, there is no definite synthesis or conceptual form resolving the disjunction, but only local synthesis and relatively provisional resolutions which never exhaust the possibilities of the disjunctive couple. Nor are the two prescriptions resolved in a dialectical contradiction or unity of opposites. Rather, the relation at stake is subjectively an antagonistic opposition which is held together in the form of productive tension anchored in bare subjectivity. This antagonistic disjunction and the will to sustain the tensions between its two components constitute the veritable gravitational field of Weber's thought. Indeed, sustaining this fundamental tension, mainspring of all other tensions, at every point was imperative for Weber, and those familiar with him know the uncompromising way in which he stood by it. Weber referred explicitly to what that imperative meant subjectively for him. I want to see, he said, how much I can endure. This attitude, this will, first superbly defined by Nietzsche, plays a constitutive role in Weber's thought, for it is what holds together the tensional disjunction. Weber felt it as an imperative, but he did not remain there. He also enjoined the youth, and in truth anyone, to do the same. Not only, as we already know, to ruthlessly scrutinize the realities of life, but to bear such realities and inwardly measure up to them. It is almost impossible to exaggerate the importance of that will, since everything decisive is at stake in it. At issue in that will is one's own worth as a human being capable of being a subject and not merely an individual. That is, the worth of one's conviction and the inner strength to deploy it in a continuous confrontation with the world. This confrontation does not take place with the world as a totality, which is an inconsistent idea, or in an open clash, but above all in the form of a conduct of life, Lebensführung, that fundamental Weberian concept, which in its adjective sense stands for a life that does not simply slip by at the mercy of the pushing and pulling forces of the world, but is, quote, consciously conducted or self-determined. Now, the second moment regarding the characterization of Weber's stance has to do with the existential orientation of that stance. And the question to be posed here is Weber a teacher of disillusion and conformism? Is Weber a teacher of disillusion and conformism? This question is the direct implication of a dogma in Weber scholarship, a dogma rarely made explicit but governing mainstream interpretations, namely that the confrontation prescription has the upper hand. In other words, that the state of the world has to be respected, because the state of the world will always tell you, oh, what you want to do is impossible. So that the confrontation prescription has the upper hand and is therefore a call not just to caution or restraint, but ultimately to renunciation and resignation. But Weber did not, in principle, concede overall precedence to any of the components of the subjectivation figure, and certainly not to the confrontation prescription, which would have implied a total defeat of the subject and made of Weber a teacher of disillusion and conformism. It is true, however, that Weber's own tactics and formulations invite such partial readings, as he tends to start his interventions with external conditions of the problems addressed and to accentuate what may thwart the desire. So he starts with an attempt to see how the world is, attempt to see the situation of the world, and on the basis of that, deploying one's conviction, one's desire. So he accentuated this aspect, and so this aspect that may thwart the desire, the conviction, and disrupt self-indulgent attitudes, as is the case with the famous uncomfortable facts. It's a famous Weberian expression, whose recognition is crucial to deploy the conviction in the world. Now, what is often overlooked in that connection is that Weber lived in very passionate times. Not only that, but personally connected as he was with youth movements and with revolutionaries of various sorts, he witnessed very closely and with deep preoccupation the mounting of that distinctive subjective mark of the short 20th century, which Badiou called the passion for the real. And this is just the kind of thing a proud bourgeois thinker as Weber was, a condition he more than once proclaimed openly in private correspondence and publicly, most famously in his academic baptism, in his inaugural address when he was appointed as professor of political economy. I am a member of the bourgeois classes, he said, and feel myself to be a bourgeois. So a proud bourgeois thinker as Weber was could not allow this to pass this passion for the real without a dogged and unremitting fight. All the more so considering that the advance of that revolutionary passion was taking place at a critical conjuncture marked in Weber's eyes by a political crisis of the system of rule domination with Juncker patriarchal authoritarianism. The Junker were the aristocracy of Prussia in their own terms. That is, as you know, all aristocracy is an oligarchy. So the Junker were the Prussian oligarchy. So the problem was that the Junker patriarchal authoritarianism was quickly being undermined by the unstoppable rise of industrial capitalism and the German bourgeoisie, and this was Weber's desperation, was hopeless, unable to take on rule domination and to make it suitable to capital, which is what Weber wanted. The stakes could not be higher for Weber. He could therefore afford to take the conviction, the demon, as a given, and start with examination of external reality, examination of the conditions of the world. This method of intervention enabled Weber to tame the demons, to begin with his own, and then the students, in order to so much the better conjure them later on and test their inner strength by setting them face to face against reality, against the world. A method taken to its climax in his lectures on science and on politics, when he resorted to those phrasings pregnant with typical Weberian pathos. In this respect, the reading of the Confrontation prescription is a question of seeing reality without illusions is certainly correct. However, this reading is partial insofar as it is not immediately put into relation with the necessity to obey the demon. Some would be tempted to suggest that Weber opposed, what he opposed to the passion for the real was the passion for reality. That is to say, the passion for the constraining forces, for reality as a power of intimidation, for things as they are, which is what has true power. That will be insulting to Weber, the man who engaged in a lifelong struggle to spur his own class to affirm itself politically, a task which required to quench the revolutionary flames and to avoid reaction, which he feared nearly as much as revolution. He shows that without illusions doesn't mean without conviction or desire. Against such conformists, Weber resorted more than once in his interventions to the classical metaphor of the good archer. For what is possible would never have been achieved if, in this world, people had not repeatedly reached for the impossible, end quote. It is therefore true that Weber argued insistently against indulging in one's desire. It is equally true, but often overlooked, that he stressed instead, particularly to the youth, the necessity of educating desire by subjecting it to the test of a continuous confrontation with the world. But it is not true that this makes Weber's stance, or the confrontation prescription in particular, a call for the suppression of desire and thus for resignation. After all, obey the demon cannot mean obey it today and give it up tomorrow. Nor has anybody ever heard or read Weber enjoining anyone to give up on their desire. So we move now to the ontological foundations and the existential deployment of Weber's stance. Now, Weber famously referred to Machiavelli and said that Machiavelli's stance towards the world was an affirmative stance of proud disworldliness. But this that he attributed to Machiavelli can well also be characteristic of his own stance. The carriers of this affirmative stance of proud disworldliness unhesitantly place themselves in the world, a world which is not merely their dwelling, passively accepted as the place to live, which has fallen to their lot, but reality, to be confronted as it is. Reality, or in rare occasions life, or the reality of life, is Weber's name for what there is prior to any evaluation. In this respect, ontologically, Weber's relied on one single ontological statement, namely that what there is, or reality, is infinite multiplicity. That's how he qualified it. This is the most one can say about reality, according to Weber, when what there is subtract from any evaluation and thus from the realm of meaning or sense. Now, Wirklichkeit, reality, for Weber, rather than a strict ontological category, is a category of existence. What predominates is thus not the ontological idea of being qua being, but the existential meaning. That is to say, quote, the reality of the life in which we are placed and which surrounds us in its specificity, end quote. And it is primarily reality in this sense, to which the predicate infinite multiplicity also applies, that the carrier of the Weberian stance confronts. Indeed, it is in connection with such reality, which is a realm of existential choice, that confrontation acquires all its pathos. Now, reality is confronted in the usual twofold process. On the one hand, as per the prescription to ruthlessly examine it without concessions to the desired veering conviction, and on the other, as per the prescription to obey the demon as a testing ground to assert oneself as subject by deploying the desire in the world. The former is the task of the science of reality as analysis of external conditions. The latter is that of the science of the demon as an analytics of subjectivation. Although both tasks are brought together in this operation, the disjunction cannot be resolved by science, but only by
yes, I believe so. Yes.
Sorry.
What is going on?
I don't know. Someone with 917 is, you know, I don't know who it is, but yeah, anyway, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Carlos. Just continue to speak. I don't know what the problem is with this person.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, please. It's
okay.
the demon.
So,
yeah.
Yes.
The demon.
Although both tasks are brought together in this operation,
right,
the disjunction cannot be resolved by science, but only by what one should call existential decisions, and at the local or concrete level alone. So not once and for all. Science can bring us every time at the very point of the decision, a point which forbids the striking of any balance. Hence, it is heavily anti-liberal, contrary to what mainstream Weber scholarship argues about Weber, for it is an either-or point, or an instance thereof, such as commitment or indifference, permanence in the commitment or renunciation, or, as Weber puts it, yes or not. Science, quote, can direct the human being to this edge of the yes or no. However, the yes or no itself is no longer a question of science, but of one's conscience or subjective taste. End quote. Such points are not at all chosen, but imposed upon the subject who confronts the world seriously. They thereby constitute as many tests of one's own conviction. Weber is thus very close to Kierkegaard, whose doctrine of radical choice is underpinned by the attempt to develop a procedure of constraint aimed at forcing the person to the point of decision and compelling her to choose. And yet, this proximity cannot hide fundamental differences with Kierkegaard. The first difference lies in that Weber's procedure of constraint puts science at its service. Science thus appears both as fulfilling a decisive function, since it can bring us to the existential points of decision, and in all its limitations, having to fall silent at these very moments. By doing that, science provides clarity, Weber argues in Science as a Vocation. First of all, as he had sustained in his interventions on academia and the articles that he wrote on the university and academia, clarity about, quote, which gods the individual serves, end quote. For science can teach the individual, quote, to know what he wants. This clarity is a necessary condition for there to be existential points at all. And if there are points, then one will find it difficult, as Weber insists in Science as a Vocation, to escape their compelling force. The teacher can, Weber says, thanks to science, place before you the necessity of making this choice. But, end quote, but once there, science withdraws discreetly, and the choice or decision falls entirely on our naked subjectivity or unaided conscience. As Weber had already stated in the Objectivity Say almost 15 years before the Science as a Vocation lecture, the decision is certainly not the task of science, but of the desiring human being. That's Weber's expression. Science, in other words, cannot free us from the responsibility of deciding and choosing, and of having to do so without props, relying only on our ability to endure the irreducible excesses and the consequent inescapable tensions. Indeed, those who accuse Weber of decisionism, and there are many, do so from a kind of normativism, which for Weber was nothing but plain evasion, disguised by what one might well call the bureaucratization of existential points. A second fundamental difference with Kierkegaard lies in that there are no hierarchically ordered stages of existence. In Kierkegaard, there are aesthetic, ethical, and religious, or rather Christian stages, which are practically as many, ever higher forms of conscience. Weber's sketch of a theory of points or existential alternatives is the utter antithesis of any such hierarchy. Absent by the chain metaphor, he resorts to in what is probably the most Platonic moment of a work critically punctuated with strategic references to Plato. Life as a whole, Weber declares, to the extent that it is inwardly conducted or subjectivated, is a chain of ultimate decisions through which the soul, as in Plato, chooses its own fate, in the sense of the meaning of what it does and is, end quote. So that is the question of the existential determinations and deployment of Weber's stance. We have to address now the play of tensions, the fundamental tensions between these two prescriptions: confront the world, analyze the world in the most ruthless way, and obey the demon. The play of tensions in the mode of distance. And here we have two fundamental aspects regarding the play of tensions in the mode of distance. So the play of tensions, let's say, from afar, responsibility and value freedom. Now we enter here into a very problematic and controversial aspect of Weber's thought. While distance is always distance from one's inner conviction or ultimate value, there are two fundamental modes which correspond to the two sides of the tensional disjunction. Responsibility is the name for distance in relation to the deployment of that conviction in the world. Value freedom, Wertfreiheit in German, is the specific Weberian name for distance in relation to the examination of the world. Responsibility involves a mode of distance which we might call ethical, since it primarily concerns action, and thus distinguish it from the epistemic distance involved in value freedom, which essentially concerns the quest for and the evaluation of knowledge. Now, the problem with the question of responsibility is that Weber tended to conceive of it and did use it, undoubtedly as a consequence of his dread of the rising power of communism and revolutionary Marxism, as an external regulator, as if responsibility were an autonomous value or norm to be brought to bear as a separate and full-fledged ethics against the ethics of principal conviction. However, responsibility is only meaningful in connection with causes or values. It is for the latter's sake, that is to say, quote, in the form of service to a cause, and thus as responsibility for that cause, end quote, the responsibility is called for. Detached from such causes or values, responsibility is simply the diktat of the status quo, which discloses the fact that in the decisive situation, one ultimately adheres to what there is, to the world as the world is. In this sense, the ethics of responsibility, assuming there is such a thing, is not only a warning against any attempt to change the established order, but a regular teaching to discourage belief in the capacity of women and men to transform their world. But divested of this deeply conservative, added-on articulation, responsibility is the way of relating in an immanent way and in the mode of distance to the ultimate values. This is consistent with Weber's thought and stance. Indeed, he himself made it absolutely clear at the end as politics as a vocation that both ethics, if we accept that there are two ethics at stake, quote, are mutually complementary, and only in combination do they constitute the genuine human being who is capable of having a vocation for politics, end quote. This is at the end of politics as a vocation. In other words, the capacity of being a subject entails responsibility as an immanent disposition, and as such, subordinated to the vocation, the cause, or the conviction. So, not responsibility as an injunction of the status quo to say, do not try to change it, keep things as they are. But Weber, as I just mentioned, played a lot and used a lot of responsibility in this way to try to fight against the rising communism and revolutionary Marxism. Now, if responsibility is the hallmark of Weber's politics, value freedom is the hallmark of his science. Contrary to its canonical interpretation, it's still very influential as a methodological requirement aimed to adopt a positivist attitude of supposed neutrality in scientific inquiry. Value freedom is best seen as a practical injunction inseparable from the Weberian stance as a whole. Value freedom lies indeed at the core of Weber's stance. It grounds its epistemic mode of detachment. In this respect, the fundamental one in my view, value freedom is Weber's philosophical and political rupture with the reign of opinion, as well as with the accumulated dust of tradition and routine convention in social inquiry. As Frederick Jameson argued back in the early 70s, value freedom is undoubtedly, quote, an active and polemic weapon, a mode of self-affirmation and of intellectual conquest, end quote from Frederick Jameson. It requires value freedom and extraordinary discipline in order not to fall prey to premature evaluations. Value freedom is thus Weber's ceaseless attempt to reset the gaze and redefine the mediations with the world, both conceptually and by sharpening judgment and other mediating abilities. Value freedom enjoins us, quote from Weber, to transform what is conventionally given into a problem, end quote, or, à la Foucault, to problematize what is taken for granted. Now, let's go to the last point of what I wanted to do here with you today, which is about the priority of subjectivation over rationalization. You might think, why are we addressing this point? Well, because it's important in itself, but also to counter the importance that has been given to rationalization and the neglect of subjectivation. So Weberian social science investigates the complex dynamics between two poles, that of the subject, the anchor point whose regular way of holding on to the tensions results in a personality and a conduct of life, and that of the world or reality, understood in terms of life orders and powers. This is a fundamental concept in Weber's thought that we cannot address here. Their meeting point is the human type. In the terms we have been using here, the human type is a kind of constituted subject, which for Weber provides the measure or a standard to judge or evaluate any social order, whether a whole society or a specific order within it, for example, the economic order. In other words, you want to know how good a society is? Look at the type of human beings it favors and shapes. The task of investigation that Weber thus sets for social scientists, eminently Platonic and empirical all at once, consists in identifying the types of human beings especially favored and hindered by any given life order or any given society, and investigating how the former are shaped and the latter prevented from developing. That will be a Mossad program of inquiry to investigate and evaluate the life orders and powers that define our own times. Unfortunately, it is unlikely that this will ever happen, for it is the fate of Weber science to be endlessly talked about but rarely practiced. Crucial in that kind of investigation is the study of the possibilities for the development of subjectivation. Weber was very insistent that what matters and what needs to be studied is how human beings are, rather than how they feel or enjoy, which goes totally against the contemporary, nihilistic, one has to say, concern with life experiences, happiness and well-being, concerns dictated by the capitalist corporations and accepted, whether willingly or grudgingly, by many social scientists. Most readings of Weber neglect subjectivation, the demon, and tend to give priority to rationalization. Indeed, in the endless dispute about the unity of Weber's thought, unity that has never been found, rationalization has been considered as what provides thematic unity to Weber's thought. But in my understanding, the unity of Weber's thought is not provided by any topic or any specific subject matter. It is not the unity of a finished work, nor a thematic unity, as I was saying, but is the unity of a continuous endeavor consistently evolving according to an immanent logic, the logic provided by Weber's figure of subjectivation or stance, precisely. However, rationalization needs something. So those who give priority to rationalization and neglect, don't even talk about subjectivation, need to understand that rationalization needs something on which to work. As Weber makes clear in one of the most significant pieces he wrote, known as the Intermediate Reflection, quote, "The command over men that the rational has is only effectual if there is a stance," end quote. In other words, the demon or the conviction provides the material for rationalization to work. For otherwise, without this basis, the power of reason finds no grip. We can define subjectivation as the joining together of a demon or an ultimate conviction, an ultimate cause, or more formally, an axiomatic prescription and the desire making it alive, and the power of reason to consistently unfold it in confrontation with the world, with reason always acting after the subjectivation event or on the latter's production. It is precisely a particular historical figure of subjectivation what Weber investigates in the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, which, quote, quite deliberately studies the effects that the subjective appropriation of ascetic religiosity, the demon, produced in the conduct of life. Such effects are indeed revolutionary, as the whole life, initially of the petite bourgeoisie, was subjected to a methodical and ascetic conduct of work, initially sustained by the religious beliefs, but later on rationalized and working mechanically, needing religious beliefs, subjectivation no longer. Subjectivation thus acted as a vanishing mediator. Among the revolutionary forms of subjectivation, there is charisma, the most powerful of them all for Weber, who was gripped by it. What happens almost systematically after a charismatic event is the rationalization process, a process which Weber calls routinization of charisma. It means the excretion of charisma on the everyday. Rationalization can also be revolutionary, Weber argues. The difference lies in that whereas charisma revolutionizes from within, rationalization revolutionizes from without. And this difference is indeed crucial. We cannot enter into more details here now. The neglect of subjectivation is, in my view, the main weakness of much of Weber's scholarship, a neglect redolent of a problem Nietzsche diagnosed among we scholars. We scholars is the title of a major chapter in Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. So the problem that Nietzsche diagnosed among we scholars is a deep-rooted penchant to break every thought vow, or even better, to unbend it. That's from Beyond Good and Evil. So to conclude, the subversive aspect in Weber's thought lies in the pure form of his figure of subjectivation or stance. It is, in other words, the stance divested of any substantive value other than the conviction that it is by holding on to the antagonistic tensions between the demon, subjectivation, and the world that significant transformations in the world and in oneself, also part of the world, can be effected. All that is required is demons, or at least one, and tensed walls, or walls in tension, at least one, that is, walls with existential points. But if there are demons, there will be tense walls. Indeed, an atonic wall is the unmistakable sign of conformism and mere adaptation to the world. And if there are tense walls, then demons are likely to be arising. It does seem appropriate to stress that if we hold onto the standpoint that truly matters, that of keeping the bow drawn with a view to striking the arrow so as to produce some meaningful effect in the world, subjectivation is the critical problem to investigate, and Weber's social and cultural science is the science devoted to its study. A science not simply of man, as Hennis had it. Wilhelm Hennis published an important book which is called A Science of Man, Max Weber's science. So it's not simply a science of man, as Hennis maintained, that is not simply a humanistic science, still less a posthumanist science of human and non-human entities in a flattened world which will deny, as new materialists and posthumanism and ontologists do, subjectivation, but in consonance with this fundamental inhuman aspect of Weber's thought that seeds the human animal within the human element itself, a science of demonized humans and rationalized demons. Weber insisted on enduring the tensions with the utmost gravity and seriousness, as if he were unmusical to play them in another order of reality, that of irony and comedy, which enable not only distance, but an inner ductility especially suitable to bear the tensions without in the least unbending the bow. And musicality surely related to that severity of countenance which makes Weber resemble the ancient prophets. And yet, he was not fully at home in that faithful and pessimistic side of life either. Weber's strained confrontation with that side is expressed in the despairing finale of Politics as a Profession and a Vocation, which will be the proper title of this lecture, normally is understood as politics as a vocation. It is a tension-ridden moment engaging intertwined temporalities. So at the end of politics as a vocation, we are dealing with this. A tension-ridden moment engaging intertwined temporalities, and Weber is intent on interpellating the most militant section of the revolutionary youth. At stake is the inner strength of their conviction, and therewith their subjective destiny. But lurking powerfully in the background is Weber's own destiny. A real present is the focus of a heightened sense of temporality, a present defined by German defeat and the ongoing revolution. This lecture, Politics as a Vocation and as a Profession, was taking place on the 28th of January of 1919. So Germany had been defeated, and there was an ongoing revolution, undecided, but rapidly weakening and increasingly threatened by escalating reaction. For Weber, that present is haunted by the immediate past, the outbreak of the revolution, and the bleak future he envisages. The revolution had ruined the last possibility for which Weber had clung. A final, desperate national uprising as a card in the game of negotiations with the victorious powers that defeated Germany in the First World War. And this is a quote from Mommsen in his book, Weber and German Politics. In this situation, and despite his fierce opposition to the revolution, Weber doesn't summon the youth to give up on their conviction, which would have implied a total betrayal of his own stance. What he does is to put it to a very harsh trial. So he puts the youth and their conviction to a very harsh trial. If forced to undergo the prolonged and terrible age Weber anticipates, a polar night of icy darkness and hardness, he says, they stick to their conviction and therefore refuse to accommodate to the normalcy of that age, a normalcy made up of all the trodden paths of subjective defeat, including conformism, evasion, cynicism, and renegacy, then they will have been inwardly unmatched, says Weber, for their times and their everyday existence. Weber's stance does prevail, which shows its universal significance, regardless of Weber's concrete politics. Weber's concrete politics that we are going to see in my second session next Sunday, the 18th. Hence, the necessity of revisiting the relation Weber and the left, a task for a future inquiry. Well, and this is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. That was excellent presentation. Thank you very much. 1 hour and 10 minutes of nonstop thought, and excellent. Yes, Ken, welcome. We didn't see you in the beginning, and welcome to Vespina too. The other people were here for the beginning. Hi. Yeah. So Ken, I saw your hand up. Yeah. Ken. Yeah.
I was just clapping.
Oh, you were clapping. Okay, it was a hand clap. Okay, I got you. The Zen approach to Zoom. Okay, excellent. Okay, so yeah, I mean, an excellent presentation. You packed a lot into it. My first question, if you will, is this notion of stance, and I'm certainly not a Weberian or a Weber scholar. I've read, and certainly, I've read the Protestant Ethic, and it seems like you're drawing a lot from the 1918 period, particularly science as vocation and politics as vocation in your talk today and where you're going, but it's much more comprehensive to all of Weber's work. My notion of or trying to think this through, does stance, the way you're using it, sort of anticipate what we get later in Heidegger of thrownness? We're posited into the world, and then ultimately existentialia, and then of course the Sartrean position of existential positionality, and this very active term during the 1950s and 60s of subjectivity. I'm just wondering if there's a relationship to these many ways of trying to get around this notion of both rationalization, right, or objectivity, value-free inquiry, and all of these methodological considerations you're bringing up. And just want to kind of look at this in terms of the language. I know that Badiou will certainly begin with the theory of the subject later, and we can talk about that in relation to subjectivation. But I just wondering this notion of stance, how you're using it, how Weber is using it, and then in relation to other aspects. And as we know, Lukács, in his 1967 preface to History and Class Consciousness, kind of denies, he says, well, my glasses were tinged with the spectacles of Simmel and Weber. And I'm just wondering if you had a comment about that too, vis-a-vis stance and subjectivity too, as well. Yeah. So I know there's a lot packed in there, but maybe it's a starting point.
Well, Lukács was a regular visitor every Sunday to Weber's house, and they were having discussions there during years. Yes, I mean, I could refer also. I mean, as we are talking about Lukács, I could refer to reinforce this point that the stances, regarding the stances, the position one takes in relation to oneself and the world, but a position which is not something, a passing moment, is something that is consistent and is maintained in time, is that in 1920, Lukács was in trouble in Hungary, in his own country, and he had been detained. And there was a petition in Germany by a number of intellectuals, quite more than 100, that signed a petition in favor of Lukács. Weber did not sign it. And then you have the standard mainstream Weber scholars arguing that Weber didn't want to get engaged in this problem, and that you cannot claim that he was defending his friends, etc. But Weber actually, there is a letter from Weber to Lukács from March 1920 explaining to him why he didn't sign this public declaration. And it is because he had written to the Hungarian Minister of Information asking for him to allow Lukács to come back to Germany. And in this letter, Weber tells Lukács, he says, I told the minister I will not participate in any public call or whatever. So it was a personal letter to the, I have here the letter, so I can read the crucial aspect for you. It says, I did not sign the recent public appeal because I had written earlier to the Minister of Justice in Budapest on your behalf and noted that I will not join any public action. There are other aspects in the letter. So what I wanted to reflect here is how Weber's stance, which was heavily conservative, strongly nationalistic, strongly imperialistic, however, he respected in that sense, and this is what I want, and this is the subversive aspect of Weber's thought, in my view. There is no other, because he was a nationalist, he was an imperialist. He, like Nietzsche, I don't know how thinkers of that stature can say things as they say about Germany. I thank God for having been born a German. Such a stupidity that both of them said, Nietzsche and Weber. And nevertheless, you have Weber, saying to Lukács when they were, this letter begins, the letter I read you from, saying that their positions couldn't be more opposite at that moment between Lukács and Weber. However, Weber tries to help him. Weber was also doing the same with other revolutionaries. In Germany, there had been the Spartacist revolution, and he was following it very closely. He was trying to act with judges and in the courts in favor of revolutionaries who had been, some of them, students of him. So he was totally opposed to revolution. Nevertheless, he respected the people who were, faithful to their convictions and had ultimate, what he called ultimate values, ultimate causes, and were faithful to them. Now, regarding Heidegger, I think, Heidegger famously says in Being Untying, talks about being in the world, and that's the fundamental ontological position of Dasein. But for Weber, there is no being in the world, because there is no peace in that sense. In that case, there is being in discord with the world. There is no being in the world. There is only being in discord with the world. And there is this tension with the world all the time. And this is, let's say, the ontological aspect of Weber's stance. So we could comment more here, but I don't know the extent to which, this is
just trying to look at the distinctions that that are being made here, in a kind of material conceptual trajectory, in a sense, that ultimately we also have existential position, right, in the return of subjectivity, which is a term that is being, thrown out with a baby in the bathwater now in lieu of the subject, right? And subjectivity is now about the subject, and now we have the language of transindividuality, transindividuation, that has come on the scene. So these seem to me to follow, and I'm not trying to be linear here, but there is some kind of conceptual interlinkage that's going on if we return back to the thought of the turn of the century, beginning with Musil's The Man Without Qualities in fiction, as well as, how we've, gotten 100 years later, how we're in this new language and, what would be the relation. So when you speak of subversive Weber, it seems like the return of Weber is a way of maybe reorienting some of these questions too, where the return, if you will, of the stance, the return of, the existential position, if you will, right? But discord, you said, which is interesting. Yeah, Heidegger doesn't have the discord because he has no social world, right? In a way, being has no Mitsein, so there can be a discord. Yeah.
I see there a question from Teresa. Yes, weren't there other Frankfurt School theories who, like Lucas, use pieces of Weber's there? Well, above all, Adorno. Adorno drew a lot on Weber in his own way, including in his, his aesthetic work, his works on aesthetics and his work on music. And in reality, I think, some very significant figures on the left, philosophers and social scientists, appreciated Weber. And this is quite telling, but I have never seen any analysis of Weber highlighting this, that in reality, the subversive aspect of Weber lies in his stance. Adorno made a lot of Weber's analysis of rationalization in music and developed it further and in his own, but draw a lot on Weber, for example. So several aspects, I think, of Weber's thought were fundamental. And going back for a second to Heidegger and Jaspers in their correspondence, and also in the correspondence of Hannah Arendt and Jaspers, they refer to Weber a number of times, and it has interest, not only gossiping interest, some theoretical interest, what they claim, but in general, I think none of them, in my view, neither Jaspers nor Hannah Arendt, in my view, grasp the fundamentals of Weber. But the existential dimension of his thought was something, for example, that for Jaspers was meaningful, because Jaspers himself, his thinking was a form of existentialism, let's say, yes. But the Frankfurt School, yes, very significantly,
Speaking of music, Weber's wife, Marianne, said he told her he was religiously musical, just religious musical, which is kind of
Yes.
interesting. You know,
Famously,
brought
yes.
up the relationship of
Yeah.
to Adorno in that regard.
Peter, I think you wanted to say something.
No, on that, if in your judgment, Carl Loews' book on Weber and Marx is the best one in highlighting some of the overlap, you know, and going beyond the stereotypical interpretations or reception of Weber as a kind of anti-left, anti-Marxist thinker.
Well, once again, yeah, I think this is a significant question. My impression is that it's the beginning of what you say, or only the beginning. And this beginning is triggered by the comparison itself. Because the figure of Marx there makes a counter to Weber, and the figure of Weber makes a counter. I mean, Loews' analysis, I think, is better, his analysis of Weber than his analysis of Marx in his book, Marx and Weber. But it's a beginning of going beyond. Regarding the ontological position of the stance, for example, I'm critical of Karl Loews because he draws on Heidegger. And we go back to what I said before. Heidegger, in his idea of being in the world, Dasein, the human being in the world. For Weber, there is no such a being in the world. There is only being in discord with the world, being in conflict with the world. But I think, yes, Loews is a beginning of that. Anyway, it's much better than a lot of standard mainstream Weber scholarship, I think.
We have Tom Bottomore, right? Tom Bottomore kind of continues with Loews. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
I think, yeah.
Marxists who have tried.
There's the whole school, Brian Turner.
Yeah.
There's the whole school of Marxists who are not so orthodox, of course, or dogmatic as to be uncharitable or to reject Weber, but to do serious work on him.
Yeah. I mean, I think among Marxists, there are quite clearly national currents. You have the Carlo Witt in France and what is around it, which is very significant. Michael Levy, sorry, yes. And then in Italy, goes without saying, perhaps the most important scholarships in some respects, going beyond the trodden paths, Marxist Italian scholars on Weber, and then, well, you have the continental Marxists, you have other thinkers there that even though later they renounced, like Lucas himself.
Yes.
But I think Weber was important for him. But yeah, there are some very significant Marxist figures who appreciated critically Weber, and yeah.
But I have a substantive question beyond the literature, and you brought up an important point about Weber being explicitly and self-admittedly a bourgeois. It's many implications. And you also emphasized what was a main or key question in Weber, and not only Weber at that time, the analysis of social types, the kinds of individuals produced by society. So obviously the implication is that the society produces bourgeois individuals in ways that differentiate them from others. There's a kind of sensibility that is distinct. One question I have is if there is still such a distinction. I mean, in terms of social inquiry, this question is almost completely forgotten now. There's no one, I think, today who does this kind of analysis.
No.
In fact, are there multiple types of individuals produced today in contemporary societies, or is everyone more or less homogeneous in terms of that? Is there a distinction between a bourgeois type and a proletarian or a lumpen proletarian, or are they all of the same type at this point?
I don't know. You pose a question that I can speculate now.
My impression. Get a good bottle of expensive wine, and yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we
No,
need to be a little more, yeah, I don't know if it's just an either or question, right? I mean, there seem to be degrees here, right, in a sense. And maybe this could lead to a discussion about, why is it that identity politics has taken on such a role at this point instead of what you were talking about, Peter, the notion of the ideal type and that Carlos alluded to. We no longer have the ideal type talked about, but we have nothing but identity politics, right? I don't know if that would shift the discussion.
Well, it's not ideal type in this case.
Yeah.
Is the idea that society produces different kinds of individuals. In the end, the bourgeoisie, they have a different sensibility, different notions of what is beautiful and what is ugly, different notions of honor, different notions of noblesse oblige, or different qualities that characterize different types. And one question I have, I don't have the answer, necessarily, but it seems to me that there is less and less and less a diversity of types produced in contemporary societies. It's a much more homogeneous,
Yes, that was my impression when you were posing the question before. I haven't done an analysis, but that these differences have been totally blurred. And now there is, and people aspire more to be, a kind of, I will find it difficult to call it bourgeois today, because this figure of the bourgeois, I think it has somehow, it's distinguishing, I think.
I mean, can you call Bill Gates bourgeois?
Yeah, but
or even Donald Trump, or these people, can you call them bourgeois the same way Max Weber, is thought of as bourgeois? Or
no way, no way.
No, of course not. Yeah, but we have categories like nouveau riche that produce characters like Donald Trump. The people.
But that presupposes the other side.
I'm sorry, yeah, but I mean, you can think about this too, the old distinction between old money, who fills their apartments with either antiques or this kind of thing, versus the newer furniture, who spends the money on the garishness. Then these questions of taste still are out there, the judgment of taste. I think it's important to keep that in mind, that aesthetic taste is still operative. Look at Bourdieu's book, Distinctions, for example, too. Another thing that goes on in class, right? In class,
that was 50 years ago.
Yes, that's true. But I mean, we don't really hang with those people. I mean, one of my cousins, they live in a different kind of opulence than I do. They're very, so they have a distinguishing characteristic. Their wine is very different in their, et cetera, what they're focused on. So I'm not so sure it's completely homogenous now.
Carl, is there?
No, it's not completely.
Yeah. Is there a sense in which Weber's embrace or claiming of bourgeois status is something of a disclaimer or an apology or an acceptance of limitation against his own bourgeois inevitability? I mean, I feel that way as a member of an intelligentsia class who has been underemployed consistently and underpaid and exploited, that there's a tension about identifying with proletariat because I'm of an intelligentsia class. Is there an aspect of trying to find a way to embrace pride for something better, or embrace a status that one cannot refuse?
You mean in Weber?
Yeah.
When he claims to be able, no, I think in my view, he purported to embody the ideal bourgeois subject. So proud and with sense of, how can I put it? Sense of having mastery also over people. And he was very explicit. He was defending he was trying to help the German bourgeoisie to take power, to take power from the Junkers, from the oligarchs from Prussia, and so in that sense, perhaps we have some difficulties today to understand the implications of Weber's claim that he made very often of being a bourgeois and he and defending it. Yeah.
As opposed
Yeah.
to an oligarch.
Sorry?
In opposition to an oligarch.
I couldn't hear. In opposition to whom?
A bourgeois in opposition to an oligarch. She's looking
yes.
in opposition to the oligarchic class, right?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely,
right.
Absolutely.
Which is in part what I'm trying to express is that there's a natural affinity that must be disrupted, and therefore I claim something anti-oligarchic that's both humble and realistic. I can't not be bourgeois, but I'm acting for class struggle nonetheless.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a tricky. I mean, in the next Sunday, what I'm going to do, what I seek to do, focused upon in part in Weber's politics and his political sociology of domination. And he defends there in his political writings the oligarchy. He attacks them, and at the same time he defends them, but he defends men of property as the men who naturally are gifted to command other human beings, So, and he himself knows that the German bourgeoisie will become an oligarchy. So they might have been different at the beginning of the 20th century from the Prussian oligarchy, but they will become an oligarchy immediately themselves. And so I don't know. I think he tried to embody the ideal type of the bourgeois, as having some cultural interest and that are not confined to material interests, let's say. But I don't know whether this.
Again, Carlos, going back to the artists, the novelists, the writers of the period like Musel, you can read Ulysses, Leopold Bloom as a man of no character, everyday homogenization. This is really in the mix, and in a sense, I think we're speaking about, and I think part of both the subversion and the conservative tendency simultaneously in Weber is in defense of bourgeois, right? And this stance and this subjectivity about qualitative life thing versus that of mass homogenization. And I think this is very, very, very much in the air during that time and very much part of the world. So he does have this affinity, if you will, to the bourgeois, and the haute bourgeois, if you will, as well. It's not just the bourgeois, as such, the petit bourgeois. Yeah. So please go ahead. I mean, I'm just trying to think this in terms of its historicity and also where we are. Yeah.
Okay. No, I'm reading in the chat.
Sure.
Les Cassan. All right. Okay.
Yeah. This is a question the one we're asking.
Yeah.
So very good. Yeah.
Weber has been criticized and accused of being a relativist, but I think I don't think he was a relativist. But I find it difficult how to answer your question here. I think your sense of linking it to Nietzsche and to Nietzsche's ideas is very good. Actually, Nietzsche was a very important thinker for Weber, fundamental thinker. And precisely, Weber was not a relativist because he was so much against nihilism. He was in favor of believing in something and being faithful to that belief. I will tend to put it that way. I will tend to put it that way. And he even says that if you cannot cope with this, then you go to the churches, and they will shelter you with open arms and protect you. And but then going to the churches is a kind of, fleeing from the wall, not confronting the wall. But if you confront the wall, then you will have some beliefs and ultimate causes and ultimate values, and if you are faithful to them. So very much against nihilism. And no, he himself addressed the question of relativism, and he protested against him being a relativist. He just said, and this is perhaps in his thought is correct, that you cannot prove the ultimate validity of any value. And I think this is assuming philosophy, including in Badiou's philosophy, because we talk about axiomatic prescriptions, not about proof, demonstration of the validity of truth or any other value. So, but yes, I think Weber was very much against relativism, and above all, yes, against nihilism. You have to believe in something. I think you have to find your demon and obey it.
Yes,
But
yes,
anyway,
yes, I understand this, and I agree that I guess my question is like I would ask you if you could like articulate how did Weber with his value freedom with his ideal types try to overcome relativism to a certain extent, because I think that's what he was trying to do, but it's a bit confusing in my mind. So if it would be possible for you to like articulate it a bit in more detail.
Yeah. He didn't try to articulate a full argument against relativism because he thought it was not possible. He could do that in relation to some ultimate value, for example, by telling people, including students, say, okay, your ultimate value, for example, is truth, and truth means being faithful to what you believe in truth. Then we undertake an analysis of what you can do, being consistent with that. But he never tried to develop a nobler argument because he said it. Then he will have to enter into hierarchies and subordinate some values to others. And he said that this, this was just an operation of priests, not an operation of a scientific mind. I mean, his existential approach to life meant that very often human beings, they have to make decisions on the basis of their own conscience, with the help of science, but at the point of the decision, leaving science aside and decide by themselves, without props, so without ultimate guarantees. I don't know whether I'm addressing your problem, but it's important that Weber was very aware that making an overall argument would have implied developing hierarchies and saying, some values are more important than others or are subordinated to others. And this is what he tried to avoid by all means.
I apologize for missing the beginning. I got the times confused. I was 1 hour behind. But I don't know if the way we came to think to do the seminar was we were having.
I cannot hear you well, Peter, now. Is there some kind of sound?
Maybe. I said the way we came to have the idea for the seminar. Can you hear?
Yeah, and now yes.
Was with Michael, we're having a discussion, and I paraphrased Weber on this, having the courage to see the world as it is, because we were commenting that so many of our friends, so many people on the left, not only on the left, of course, but also the left, today we're living in a kind of fantasy world, seeing they think that the revolution is going to happen tomorrow. The left is doing great. All these kinds of things. And, then I brought up Weber, and we said, we should get Carlos to do a seminar on this because it's very timely, very important for these kinds of things. Why do you think the present moment is one that is especially a moment where people are living in the fantasy world, not accepting reality, or this is a more or less universal tendency, and it was the same always, and it continues? Is there something about the present moment that makes it so that people want to live in with the narcotics, as you said?
Yeah, and I just want to add, and it's great that you brought up the narcotics and with the way Peter frames this. I mean, to my mind, yeah, one of the importance here, and actually this, what Lex brought up, the Nietzsche-Weber connection, both of whom do not flinch from confronting reality, maybe in different ways and in different styles, of course. But we seem to be living in a Marxist leftist bubble, you know, in a way, you know, if you really think about it, you know, even our friends, you know, not only the bubble that other people have lived in over this time, but what role do you see here now for Weber and this kind of clarity, this courage to think? You know, this real, what I would call the courage to think, and you would, you know, obviously alongside Badiou would say, you know, faithful to the phenomena, you know, or faithful to the event. Yeah, so please go ahead. I just wanted to add to what Peter brings up. He brings up a real question of motivation and of course our imminent condition, if you will. Yeah.
Yeah, well, in general, I think that probably most ages in the world are a little bit like us, in which people have delusions, and but perhaps in our time, this is a bit more intense. But I think we are in a moment in which I will qualify it as, I don't find a better term now, but in a moment of fascism, which comes after a moment of total nihilism. And I think Weber's thought here is very relevant because it helps us to, how can I put it, to stick to our convictions and to strive for them, to struggle for them. I don't know, the question you pose is very difficult. I try to do this in my teaching.
I know. I mean, yeah.
You know, I try to do what this kind of existential procedure whereby you reach the point of the decision and there is a yes or not, or either or. I try to put myself and put others there. And yeah, I don't know. To me, the importance of Weber's thought lies in that, in this stance, in this idea that you know, you have to be able to withstand the tensions between, you know, your desire to transform the world for good, for justice, for truth, and you know, the actual situation of the world that doesn't allow you to transform, not even sometimes in a tiny way. And nevertheless, you know, continue, never give up. So in that sense, I think that his thought is fundamental. But in another sense that we will see next Sunday, he was an amazingly conservative thinker, and you know, actually, despising the people. The people understood in the political sense, the masses, the crowds, the people, the many.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, but you pose very difficult issues that okay, we can speculate a little bit. I don't have, obviously, I don't have a fully formed judgment on them, you know.
But I think what you raised is two concepts again are really very good fodder for the discussion about, not, you say we live in nihilistic, or we live in a period of nihilism, or we've already passed through that, and now you think fascism, you know, in some ways. And then again, the question is, you know, where do we go? I mean, you know, again, this constant what is to be done, because, you know, tomorrow, I don't think Black Lives Matter is going to change the world, right? I mean, in a sense, or
yeah,
another Arab Spring or a Hong Kong, you know what I mean? I mean, I'm just saying that, yeah.
It's interesting, Michael, that you bring out Black Lives Matter, because I've been trying to acquaint myself with the Black radical tradition. And this means particularly, not only, but means particularly the States, of course. And I think there are fundamental lessons to be learned from what happened there with the, if we stick to the mid-20th century with the civil rights movement, and then with Black Power, and now with Black Lives Matter, I think that there is a lot for us to think about there and to act after doing this thinking, But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult to say. What is important is not to give up, and it's difficult. It's difficult. But this is fundamental. This is fundamental, because others will come and will continue the struggle. That's all I can say now. Going a little bit further, we will have to develop these things that Black Power was about, that, because after all, Black Power was, what was it about? Was Machiavelli in the U.S. in the 60s. So developing a popular militia. So the Black Panthers party and all this, it was about that, wasn't it? And so I don't know.
Yeah.
Those are two big problems.
Yeah. I mean, the Black Power militants didn't think about symptoms of Western nihilism or they understood this, viscerally in terms of being quote unquote the victims of it, right? They were interested in something else that was transformative, because we're speaking to ideas that are formed in, in Germany, France, England, we're thinking from the Glorious Revolution through the French Revolution here. And, in a way, the Black Power movement was thinking Santo Domingo through, the Bolsheviks to, the negritude all the way into the United States. And, and also, of course, in the backdrop of slavery and, what now is called racialized capitalism. So I think that this is, something that, I mean, you bring up in an interesting way. All I'm speaking about is the activism enough to confront this, and where are we, in terms of, if we're going to read Weber again, we're going to read Marx again seriously. We're going to read, and reading is part of the practice. Where is the relationship of, quote, the intellectual to the culture? Where is the conscience, the vocation, if you will, I think is maybe one way of putting this, of the role of, why do we reread, science's vocation? Why do we return to Weber? Why do we return to these master thinkers? Or why do I do a course in a Platonic dialogue that is about basically a slave-holding, a projection of the Egyptian caste system, but has all kinds of elements and thematics for today? So this is, I think, the question we have to ask all the time is, how do we think and think otherwise, and what does that really mean, as we go forward? So what is this act of thinking, or thinking and action together? Because when I think Peter brings up the bubble, you bring up narcotic, stance and all of this. I think we're talking about a bubble that's no longer about thought, right? It's about whatever's on the table. It doesn't matter if you have PhD or you've written 5 books. It doesn't necessarily mean, that you've gotten to the point of actual thinking, or that practice is operative. So I'm just trying to throw those things into question. I'm a big admirer of Weber's conservatism. I think I think this is great what you're doing, showing the thing. I think Gramsci, in some ways, is a radical conservative, despite in many ways. He wants to go back to the tradition of learning. If you brought Gramsci's educational programs to any department in the United States today, they're going to laugh you out of the room. That you were going to go back and read the medievalists, or the the Christian tradition, this part of the Catholic tradition, et cetera. I mean, so this is another aspect that I think we're facing too, in a way.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we have two problems. One has been partly addressed. The two problems are the idea.
Yep.
The idea, but Badio has, and Zizek and others have addressed that. It needs more. But the other is the fundamental problem that we always have and people always face is organization.
Yes.
That we are lacking. We are lacking in part because we are trapped in our petit bourgeois lifestyles. And by we now I mean leftist or supposedly leftist. And yeah, but yes, these two problems, the idea, so reinstating the idea of communism or the commons of commoning, and then organization. In reality, it's no different from the problem that that were confronted by the civil rights movement at the last moment, in the radical moment, when they were already critical of the Vietnam War and by Black Power and the Black Panthers and organization. But perhaps we don't have enough commitment to what we purport to be committed. No, I say this seriously, and I say to myself to begin
I
with.
remember the wonderful time we had in Athens when you jumped on all the intellectuals at Syriza. You remember?
Yeah.
Carlos was
Yes.
ready to go for everybody's throat at the Syriza, at the conference. For the intellectuals, all they do is talk. All they do is remember we were doing the bad thing.
Yes, because there is a habitus that and we should avoid to be trapped by this. I mean, I'm trapped as well. I don't pretend not to be, but
yes, no, I know we're all degrees. Yes.
So,
if we could be proud bourgeois, we could work against the habitus, couldn't we? If we were proud bourgeois, in a sense, couldn't we be against?
Look, Lydia, I rather confront a proud bourgeois rather than how can I put it? An idiot. I don't know how to, you know what I mean. It's not an ideal figure, but I rather have this as an enemy rather than the kind of Trumps, Brexiters, etc., that we have today, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world. In other worlds, they have other names, but they are similar.
Well, we have it in the Brazilian world as well. We have it in the Filipino world. We have it in the Indian world. We can go around the globe. It's not only specific to the Anglo-American world. It may have been predicated by Anglo-American imperialism, but yeah.
Solidarity takes money.
Right.
And a different kind of discipline than what the academic habitus instills. But I think it was never the case that the intelligentsia or the academics were the main source of revolutionary capacity. I mean, if we're waiting for the academics to make the revolution, we're going to wait forever, I'm afraid, because I agree with you. Yes, we don't fully believe, but if we believed, we would be having the seminars on how to clean the Kalashnikov rather than to discuss Max Weber, perhaps, or we would do both at least.
Both.
Yeah, you cannot expect. Yeah, but you cannot expect so much from academics.
No, but Peter, my position is not anti-intellectual, of course, but is that one has to be careful, not to be trapped in academic habits.
But always the revolutionary energy was coming from the many, not from the
Well, yes,
such a
both ends,
specialized.
Peter, both ends. I mean, you needed leadership. There are very few leaders in the 20th century of revolutionary upsurge that did not come from the bourgeois class or a highly educated class. And even Gramsci, who was, considered to be, quote, the voice of the proletariat, came from a bureaucratic class, right? I mean, at that time, there are very few people.
Well, he was well educated.
Yeah.
He was well educated.
And yeah, and as I mean, these ideas are forged by people in exile, people who had very harsh lives, people who did not, have it easy going with nice, pensions and decent salaries, etc. Lenin spent a lot of time in jail. His brother was assassinated. These were people that lived in a very different universe in a certain way. Fidel Castro, even though he came from a very, well-to-do family, spent 5 years in the hills. So, I mean, this goes without saying, and all these leaders. Nelson Mandela, who arguably could be, kind of the double bind of revolutionary practice, educated as a lawyer under the English system, and at the same time very militant, speaking of this, the stance and rationalization, that Mandela may be a good, type to analyze here. He too, spent all these years in prison, came out, and look what's happened in South Africa. So, I mean, to me, these are very complicated, yeah, I agree with you. We should have both the Chelsea Gun Club and the intellect together. Yes, I mean that's really the point. Philosophy as an arm of the revolution, as Althusser used to say, and of course, you need arms, but we're up against something very different now in a lot of ways. This is a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but my main point was that well-educated people are necessary, but academics, people who function as academics.
Yeah, of course.
It's a very conservative group overall, and I don't think it was ever the case that academics were the recruiting grounds for revolutionary leaders per se.
Well, I'm most probably by far the oldest person in the room, but when you went to a university campus in the 1960s, especially a university that had some quote status, if you will, the Black Panthers were on the campus, with paraphernalia. You had you had people speaking on campuses almost weekly. Film.
But they were recruiting their professors. They were recruiting
yes, of course. Yeah. It was very different atmosphere, very different conditions too. And
somebody put the book in the hands, right? So this is the great irony is that conscientization
I like that.
requires an education.
Yes.
So we're a part of the cycle, absolutely, and a hidden part because you have to step down once you give that education up. You give it over.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I agree. And the old slogan that you're in the institution but not of it is one way of being anti-academic as much as you can. The much of that criticism that goes on, to be, okay, I'm in it, I teach my classes, but at the same time, am I really of this spirit? Am I part of this modality? Am I part of this? Yeah, I know you can't help but, go to a few meetings, etc., but are you really of it? And that has to be always a fine line that we walk. We're on a Nietzschean tightrope all the time. That's the interesting thing. That's where we sort of dance, in a sense, and in many ways. So I had one other question, Carlos. I don't know if you're going to go there, but since Peter and Despina are both here, Castillo-Ravis did a very interesting critique of bureaucracy and Marxism.
Oh, you say Despina is here? Oh no.
Oh, Castillo-Ravis, Cornelius Despina is here. Yeah, she's on the screen here.
All right, okay.
I'm asking, this whole notion of, his study of bureaucracy, maybe how much it influenced Castillo-Ravis, and also going back to, the change, again, just changing the state, right, without the thinking that Kant advises in the great piece, the little philosophical journalistic piece. We must change thinking alongside the socio-political, revolution, that somewhat the Bolshevik Revolution was studied from the point of view of bureaucracy, right? That it became a bureaucratic communism. Not that, we're just going to dismiss it completely because of that, but that this is something that Castilloradas takes up. I'm just wondering how much of Weber is there. Maybe we could also talk about that in some of the attempts to look at, the other side, not only the fascistic or the nihilistic side of the capitalist universe, right?
Yeah. I mean, this in a way, this is a question more related to the seminar next Sunday than to today. But I feel it's fine, Michael. No, I'm just saying that it's more related to that. But I mean, what I feel as here is that, first of all, is Weber's writings on the Russian Revolution. I think they are important.
Yes.
They reflect upon a major problem, because when Weber talks about, I think that ultimately in Weber, the strongest power is the power of the everyday. And the power of the everyday means the power of rationalization, bureaucratization, routinization, etc. And in that sense, when you confront that, you will be, fated to say, okay, Weber here had a point.
Right.
However, that's not the whole point. And I seek to address a little bit that next Sunday, because he had his own problems with this, because, so being this true that very often, revolutionary moments or revolutionary events that promised a lot of good end up not delivering, or only a little bit during some time. Nevertheless, these revolutionary moments do not stop from happening. If you look at history, and this, we have to take into account that the ruling powers try to, to hide this from view, these revolutionary moments. So we have both aspects of it: the constant emergence of events, revolts, uprisings, revolutions is constant, and the fact that most of them end up, rationalized, bureaucratized, etc. So I don't know. Weber was very engaged with, and very interested and concerned. It has to do with the passion for the real, of course.
Right.
He referred to Trotsky, to Lenin, and to all of them. And I think he had, despite of himself, quite some respect for them, for these Russian Jewish revolutionaries, because he recognizes that they were very smart and very intelligent, and quite. But I mean, the point of bureaucratization, unfortunately, he's correct about that. But it needs not happen. There is not any inner necessity, and the opposite moment, continues to happen. Continues. Yeah. So I a lot of what I seek to do on next Sunday has to do with this. And this opposition, this because next Sunday is not about the subversive Weber, it's the conservative Weber.
Okay.
And it's quite amazing, some aspects of that. It's more than perhaps people think. I don't know. But yeah, he was right, Michael. I don't know what else to say. I think he was right regarding the bureaucratization. Even though he didn't understood, I think, it's astonishing how he analyzes bureaucracy, how good it is, the analysis. Nevertheless, he didn't get some fundamental that we saw through what we call the Holocaust. That is, that bureaucracies can be amazingly inventive. It's not a question of, drawing on procedure on how things were done in the past. Bureaucracies can be extremely inventive, amazingly inventive. And this is something I think that escaped him. But we'll see. I mean, he was always seeing charisma and charismatic moments as a counter to bureaucratization, which is, let's say, rationalization in social life. But he didn't see that there were creative moments on fundamental creative potential in bureaucracies.
Okay.
So,
Yeah. No. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. No. I like that. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe we should have a course in Goebbels.
all right, but why
I'm
not?
just saying. I'm kind of playing, but at another level, I'm you know, yeah, about the invention as you mentioned, and maybe you're right. Hannah Arendt probably just misunderstood, you know, Weber in some ways, you know, with Eichmann in Jerusalem, right? I mean, you know, he just was following bureaucratic orders, right? In some ways, or didn't understand.
Yes, but Eichmann precisely,
Yeah, right.
Raoul Hilbert,
Yes.
who is yet another conservative thinker,
Yes.
but amazing thinker, and I have my greatest respect for him, disagreeing, but he was voting Republican. Anyway, what is the difference between voting Republican and the Democrats sometimes? No, but anyway, Hilbert says regarding Eichmann, and in a critique of Hannah Arendt, that Eichmann was not just following order, that what he was doing was not, ordinary, evil. No, Eichmann was able to solve an amazing problem, which was how to make sure that the death trains, which had the status of touristic trains transporting the Jewish victims to the death camps, could be circulated, transported, when the trains for weaponry and everything had priority. And he had to coordinate all the trains coming from Southern Europe, from the Western France, from the North. And he managed, together with his team, to solve these problems and to do it in quite an efficient manner. You know, this is not the banality of evil at all. This is an amazing invention that he managed to do as a bureaucrat.
Right.
And this is Raoul Hilbert's critique of Hannah Arendt.
I see. Yes.
But I don't know if we enter into that, I will. Hannah Arendt, Hannah Arendt as disciple of Heidegger.
Yeah. Interesting. Yes. Very, very good. Yes. Very good. Yeah. I point people, at least from my standpoint, to the great film Mr. Klein, one of Alain Delon's last great roles by Joseph Losey, on exactly what Carlos was pointing out about the trains. Mr. Klein is a Jew who denies his Judaism. He's an art dealer who is buying paintings from his Jewish clients, right, who want to get passage out, knowing what's going on. And then finally, he comes to terms with his Jewish identity towards the end, through a relationship.
Right. That's very interesting. I don't know the film, but
on the trains, just what you're saying, the efficiency of the trains at the end, right? And the transportation. It's a very, very stark and provoking film. Yeah, Mr. Klein.
Okay. I haven't seen the film, but Joseph Losey is a very good director anyway.
Yes, great director, yes. Yeah, The Servant is another one, of his,
Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, okay, well, I mean, anybody else? I mean, I'll let Carlos, you want to have a few words, or you want to should we read anything for next week, next Sunday, or,
okay, well, all right. The best thing to read for next Sunday is the political writings published in the edition of in Cambridge. The blue covers.
Cover, Cambridge Blue, Cambridge Blue.
Weber's political writings.
Okay.
And particularly, obviously, politics as a vocation, but also all the writings that Weber did during the war. Yes, this is the fundamental reading. In that case, yes.
Okay, great, great, good. Okay. Anybody else? Peter, any comments? Any? Yeah.
No, it was very interesting.
Yes. No, it's great. You missed a very good introduction. He laid it all out, an outline of the seminar, 4 parts, right? Which you went over today. Yeah, and next week is he's dividing, the subversive and the conservative, two types. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. And yeah, thank you, Carlos, especially. Yeah.
Well, thanks to you for inviting me, and yeah, good. Perhaps we will do more in the future.
Yes,
Not only next time,
as
but
we should. Yes, as we should.
in Casos, we should do something anyway.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we've had, for those of you who don't know, we had planned, not this summer, the past, the one before, the Marxist summer school, which was to be held where I am now on this little island in Greece.
It's on the view, so that you can entice people
It's
to come
nighttime. It's
to the
nighttime.
summer school. Oh, it's nighttime? You mean there are no lights in the port? You mean you have a dark port on Greek island?
And no, but you can't. It's the sea is black. You see
Okay,
black.
it's black.
You
Okay,
can't see
I
it,
thought
yeah.
there may be
But
some. Yeah.
well, we'll hopefully do it next summer.
Yes, yeah,
You know,
2022.
pandemic, is as it, hopefully will be not as problematic. We'll do it next summer, Marxist summer school. And Carlos will be teaching,
Right,
Michael Pelias,
right.
Despina, and others.
A host of others, yes, yeah. Peter, can you stay on a minute? I have a proposal to discuss with you. Yeah. Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you.
Thank you too. Thank you.
Yeah, good
Thanks,
talk.
everyone. Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
So, Peter, Carlos, yeah, great to see you. The Left Forum wants to do I mean, I got this today kind of from Michael Lardner. They want to
leave
do
it.
a thing. Yeah, okay. They want to do a thing. Bye, Carlos. Thank you. They want to do a thing on Leo Panich and Socialist Register. So I was thinking maybe I could ask you, the Socialist Register would be participating, but I was wondering if you wanted to do a little short thing on Leo or whatever.
Yeah.
Of
Yes.
that role, right?
And
Okay.
Mihaly, I know for sure. I spoke to him for sure. He wants to participate.
June 13th to mark the calendar tentatively. Okay, June 13th, and it'd be Greg Albo, Sam Gendon, and the whole social. In fact, the articles are pretty good this year from Socialist Register. It's been a kind of special, advanced, bigger year as we go forward. Yeah.
Will
Okay.
this be online this time?
It's going to be online. Yeah. Just, I think it's not shaping up as great. In fact, this event is going to be the best event, brought to you by Socialist Register. We're trying to plan a conference for the following year for the fall in person, but I think I'm going to wait till the summer. I mean, till spring of 2022. I think it's more feasible that way, just to get more people involved. Yeah. By the way, I wanted to tell you, Brooklyn College came out with a statement, 70% online, and only 30% maximum in person. They've made it an official policy.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, you knew that? Okay.
I know.
For
The
next,
CUNY
for next
policy
semester, you
is-
mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
For fall
The
semester.
CUNY policy is to do 25% face-to-face.
Okay.
That's the line that they want, 25% face-to-face. Or
Okay.
better, if some campuses can do better.
Yeah.
But to do at least 25% face-to-face.
Right.
Yeah, I don't have anything from our City Tech. Probably it's going to be all online, or at least that's what they had announced. They have announced so far.
Mhm.
Even though they sent out a survey to see what we like, I don't know. And Baruch, I think is going to offer all choices like hybrid, full online, or
Yeah.
full, and see how it goes up to.
Right.
I think all the campuses are going to offer some of everything, but there's a physical limitation because of all the social distancing necessities and
Can I stop the
they have
recording? Yeah.